Thank you so much, Dr. Ramsey, and thank you everybody for coming here today. Let me take in the room for a second before I talk to you about what we're going to talk about. How many people here are musical theater fans? Excellent. Okay, then maybe I will nix the first 2 pages. Okay, I read the little blurb about this event and the fact that this is the second lecture in the series that explores identity, and I thought with a name like Pirooz Aghssa, you might be interested to know a little bit about my background, because the American musical theater is such an American art form. So how did I become interested in it, and what's my connection to it? So if I may tell you that, and then I'll move on. I was born in Iran, and I lived there for the first 16 years of my life. And then my family and I moved to the United States when the Shah of Iran's regime collapsed. And it was dangerous for my family to remain in Iran because my father was a general in the army under the Shah. But what brought me to the musical theater, I think, is an interesting story. Back in the late 1950s, before I was born, my mother, who had just married my father, got the equivalent of a Fulbright scholarship to study in America for an entire year. That's really unusual for a Middle Eastern woman who had just gotten married to leave for a year to come to America without her husband. She had never been outside of Iran, and she had never been on a plane. But that year in the United States completely changed her perspective about life, about what was possible, and she fell in love with America. And so she brought back a lot of pictures and books and memorabilia. And by the time that I could speak, she was telling me stories about her trip to America. So I learned about Brooklyn Bridge, Chrysler Building, all those sites before I learned anything about my own home country. One of the items that she brought back with her was a cast recording of the musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein, Oklahoma. Do you believe it? This album is over half a century old. And the fact that I brought it with me to America shows you how in love with musical theater I was. Now, I didn't speak English when I came to America. So as a child, I would listen to this album over and over and over again, not understanding the story or the language. But there was something about the music and the energy and the exuberance that came through the speakers that completely hooked me in. And I suppose that in some ways changed the course of my life. So that was one of my connections to the American musical theater. Then a few years after this, maybe I was 7 or 8 by then, a Hollywood movie came to Iran, dubbed into Persian, which is the language that I grew up speaking. And it completely captured the imagination of the Iranian public. It took us weeks and weeks before we could see the movie because every showing was sold out. The movie was The Sound of Music. And have you all seen that movie? Okay. That moment at the beginning when Julie Andrews twirls around and faces the camera and starts singing The Sound of Music, the world held its breath. Seriously. It's one of the most beautiful movie musicals of all times. So that's another connection. The third connection, still in Iran, was about a year or two after The Sound of Music, and the movie that my parents took me to see was Funny Girl, that made a star out of Barbra Streisand. Barbra Streisand became a star on Broadway doing that show, and then later the movie Do you realize that she was 21 when she got that role on Broadway? And she put such a mark on that part that that musical cannot be revived because she owns that role. Now they're talking about reviving Funny Girl on Broadway either later this year or next year. And do you know who they're going to get to play the part? Lady Gaga. That would be amazing. That would be amazing. So at age 16, I moved to America with my family. And at age 17, I made my first trip to New York City, which is incredibly crucial and incredibly exciting because that's where Broadway is. That's where musicals are. So when you're in that atmosphere, it's electric. It's amazing. So at that point in time, I was very heavily into opera. And I thought musical theater was beneath me. So I was going to the Metropolitan Opera every night seeing operas, and my friends said to me one night, when I didn't have an opera to go to, they said, "We want to take you to see a show on Broadway, a musical." And I said, "Oh, I don't want to go." So they dragged me to it. And from the moment I entered the Schubert Theater as a 17-year-old, something happened. And by the time I left the theater, I was a completely different person. That musical was a chorus line. A chorus line, which for the longest time was the longest running show on Broadway. And there's a plaque inside the Schubert Theater on Broadway that says, "A chorus line is the longest running show on Broadway." Now that distinction has been replaced by, first of all, the show Cats, and now Phantom of the Opera. But neither one of those two shows had the impact and the innovative spirit of a chorus line. So, I know that I'm supposed to talk about Funhome tonight. You all have read the graphic novel and all of that. The Jewish Studies program here at EMU is sponsoring a talk by Lisa Krone, who wrote the lyrics and the book for the musical Funhome, to be done on November 1st at 7:30 in the Student Center. Am I right? That's it. Okay. So I really encourage you to go, because Marty and I take students to New York for our class, Jewish Identity and the American Theater, and Lisa Krone talked to us and to the students. And instead of me telling you how the book was turned, the graphic novel was turned into the book of a musical, she should do so. And the story of it is incredibly fascinating. So, Funhome was produced off-Broadway originally, and then a year later, the demand for tickets were so high that it went to Broadway. So instead of talking to you specifically about Funhome, which at some point tonight I will do, what I would like to do is to talk about the historical context of the art form of musical theater that could have given rise to a work like Funhome. Where did that come from? You know what I mean? And so, Funhome was originally produced off-Broadway at the Public Theater. The same company that gave us A Chorus Line, Sweat, Hamilton. I saw Hamilton at the Public before there was any talk that it would go to Broadway, and I paid only $55 to see it. Now it's $950. You know, it's coming to Detroit. Did you know that? It's coming to Detroit this year, but you have to buy season tickets to see it. It's well worth it. So, and then another show by Jeanine Tesori, who wrote the music for Funhome, Caroline or Change, that originated at the Public. And by the way, Caroline or Change, the music by Jeanine Tesori, the book and lyrics by Tony Kushner, the great playwright who wrote Angels in America. So I want to talk a little bit tonight about off-Broadway musicals and off-Broadway shows. What are they? How are they different from Broadway shows? What makes an off-Broadway musical go to Broadway? And what is is it about some musicals that are done off-Broadway that gets in the way of them advancing to Broadway? What is that all about? So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and I want to talk about something very dear to my heart, and that is musicals with a serious intent versus musicals that are more entertainment-based, of which Funhome is an example. So the way that I'm going to go about talking about that could be a little bit subjective, but just bear with me. It's my perspective. And then finally, I want to talk about gay characters in musical theater specifically, and then generally speaking in the American theater, and something that bears studying and looking at, the fact that the number of gay men, gay male characters in plays and musicals, much higher than lesbians. In fact, Funhome is the first musical that has a lesbian woman as its leading character. And this was done only 3-4 years ago. Why is that? When we asked Lisa Krone that question, she simply said, and I asked that question, and she said, misogyny. It's true, you know. So I'm going to talk about some of these things to you. I'm a little bit lost without my PowerPoint. This is the only visual aid that I brought with me, and I'm going to use it a couple of times tonight. Okay. The history of the American musical theater, and as you know, the art form of the musical theater is very interesting to look at. I mean, what is it about a scene that has spoken dialogue in it that moves into music? For what reasons? And whether audiences know exactly why or not, they love that transition. It's something that works on people's nervous system. But really, the history of the American musical theater is the social history of America in some ways. Every decade, every era in musical theater history reveals profound truths about the American character. Our joys, our anxieties, what occupies our thoughts, what holds our attention, and especially how we see each other and how we see other people and how we treat each other as individuals and as a society. Even though the roots of the art form of the musical theater are both European and American, this is the only form of theater that was created and developed in the United States. So it is truly an American art form. It is American theater par excellence. That's a very significant point, and that's something to remember. And I believe, even though I've lived in the United States for something like 45 years, I still have a bit of an outsider's perspective. I believe that's one of the reasons why musical theater is such a popular art form, because it is American. It has a down-home flavor, down-home colors, and compared to opera, it's unpretentious. Something that Americans prize, unpretentious, even in our politics, and sometimes for very weird reasons. You know what I'm saying? And again, from an outsider's perspective, the American musical theater has that eternal American bent towards optimism. I keep thinking about 9/11 and the tragedy of 9/11 and how I traveled to New York a few weeks after it, and there was still smoke rising from Ground Zero. And then, not that long after that, it was cleaned up, and now there is something there that's shiny and beautiful and a memorial. You know what I mean? The bent towards optimism and survival and rising up when you fall is an American quality to those of us who were not born here. So, musical theater, let me reiterate, is a combination of European and American theatrical traditions, but the particular melding of these influences and traditions are uniquely American. And again, let me reiterate one more point before I go on, that in terms of the form of this art form, the structure of it, one of the most important things about it is the moving into song. Why does that happen? I mean, it could be for anybody who works in the musical theater, as an actor, as a director, as a designer, in any capacity, you have to verify why that happens. And it could be for a variety of reasons. But really and truly, at the bottom of it is when words cannot express our emotions and thoughts anymore, and you have to sing. And that's a very overwhelming thing to experience when it's done correctly. When it's not done correctly, it's painful. So some of the American influences on musical theater include minstrelsy, which was a blackface entertainment that came into fashion around the time of the Civil War, and it was very popular until the first couple of decades, maybe, of the 20th century, and it's no longer done because it is incredibly racist. But it is historically an important influence on musical theater. In addition to those, the American influences on musical theater include vaudeville, which was a kind of entertainment that if you were a performer who had a talent like nobody else, you could be in vaudeville. If you could juggle bottles, you could be in vaudeville. If you could sing high notes better than anybody, you could be in vaudeville. So that element of it and the influence that it has on musical theater is very important, because musical theater is in part the domain and the territory of the show-off. It really is. And personalities. I mean, we go to Broadway to see Gypsy with Bernadette Peters, not just anybody. You know what I mean? She plays the part. She's an actor, but she is Bernadette Peters. So a part of her personality remains visible through the role that she plays. And that's true of Patti LuPone. It's true of all the great stars of the musical theater. They don't virtually disappear into the role. They assume the role, and then they have their personalities coming through as well. So, vaudeville, burlesque, variety shows, and all of these entertainment types that I mentioned to you that comprise the American influences on the musical theater are entertainment types. You know what I mean? It's that aspect of the musical theater that is about entertaining the audience. It's the popular side of it. The storylines and the narrative thrust of the musical theater comes from opera and operetta that are European influences. So as a result, the developmental history of musical theater includes a constant transition between musicals that are more entertainment-based and those that have more gravitas and explore more serious themes. Because of that double identity, that split personality, if you will, musical theater has had to take on battles in order to be taken seriously by academia. It is only in the last few decades that universities have devoted programs of study to musical theater. For the longest time, music departments at universities would look at the musical element of the musical theater and they would think, this is not worthy of our attention. It's not Mozart, it's not Beethoven, we don't need it. So it was looked down upon. Then if you moved over to the theater departments, they would say, people who do musicals, perform in musicals, are not real actors, and these are not real plays. So, not worthy of our attention. It's only in the last 2 decades that it's been understood through research and through practice how viable it is not just as a form of theater, as a form of music, but the particular melding of those two elements places the art form in a meta area beyond the reach of either theater or music, if that makes any sense. So, as far as the entertainment value of musical theater and what made it serious and at what point, I don't know if it can be pinpointed that that's the moment that an important theme was introduced into the musical theater, but I would venture to say that the year that it happened was 1927, and it was a show entitled Showboat. So it is very true to the traditions of the American musical theater, entertainment, but it explores themes of racial prejudice, misogyny, all of those things. Something had happened, and when you think that those themes are brought up in 1927, it's something. Now, from that point on, I could bring up a lot of shows that have that kind of a serious intent within the framework of the musical theater. But I've chosen to talk to you about two musicals that I'm sure you all know. But they fall, for me, they fall under the category of traditional musical theater, but with very serious intent. So if 1927 is Showboat, 1957 is West Side Story. You all know West Side Story? West Side Story is incredibly important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that dance advances the story. That's very unique, and it gives rise to the position of the director who's also the choreographer. It's the beginning of what Bob Fosse will become in a few years. So as you know, West Side Story is about Puerto Rican immigrants in New York City and the racial tensions between them and the white inhabitants of the city. Now, for the longest time, that show, or the synopsis of that show, was explained as gang violence. But because of where we are in our political life in America, it is once again looked upon as to what it really is. It's racial tensions between Puerto Ricans and white inhabitants of New York City. And are you aware that Steven Spielberg is making a movie, is doing a remake of the movie West Side Story, and the book is written by Tony Kushner? That's going to be something, and I am sure of it, knowing why Steven Spielberg does his art the way that he does. I'm sure it's in response to what he feels politically at this particular moment. So I can't wait to see it. So the music for West Side Story was, of course, written by Leonard Bernstein, who at the time was the principal conductor of one of the most celebrated symphony orchestras in the world, the New York Philharmonic. He got that job at age 21. An absolute genius. Now let me tell you a little bit about this, because it takes me back to the idea of serious music versus entertainment music, if you will. He was a serious conductor, and he was also a serious classical composer in his own right. But his fame as a composer came from the musicals he wrote for Broadway. West Side Story, Wonderful Town, On the Town, they are all classics. His fame and achievement as a classical composer did not match his work in musical theater. And it was a fact that continually haunted him. He wanted to be the Mozart and the Beethoven of his time, but he was a musical theater composer. And this is what I mean by that, when I was talking about serious musicians not considering musical theater prestigious enough. Another musical from the same time that has that serious intent behind it is a musical called Gypsy. Are you familiar with that musical, Gypsy? It tells the story of a ferocious stage mother by the name of Rose, who will do anything to put her daughters on stage, including pushing one of those daughters, into becoming a stripper. The musical is based on real-life characters, so it's biographical, which puts it a little bit in the vein of Funhome from that perspective. But here's what I want to tell you about that musical. Near the end of the show, Rose, the stage mother, has an 11 o'clock number. Now, what are 11 o'clock numbers in musicals? In traditional musicals, an 11 o'clock number is a song that the composer and the lyricist place near the end of the show to wake up the audience that may have gone to sleep. So this is one such number. It's called Rose's Turn. It is supposed to rise up the audience, except that it is so connected to the character and the circumstances of the character in that moment in the show. Nervous breakdown. Rose is having a nervous breakdown because she has been abandoned by her daughters. So an 11 o'clock number, one of the most traditional things about musical theater, becomes unique in the service of character. The reason I mentioned West Side Story and Gypsy to you is because they have, aside from everything that I've mentioned to you, they have one more thing in common. And that is, the lyricist for both shows was Stephen Sondheim. So, Stephen Sondheim at that point was very young, and he wanted to become a composer of musical theater, and he was not allowed to do that, but he agreed to write the lyrics for West Side Story, and later on he wanted to write the music and the lyrics for Gypsy, but they told him no, he can only write the lyrics. So he said fine. But after that, he refused to do so, and he went on to have an illustrious career as a musical theater creator, not just composer and lyricist, in which he wrote the music and lyrics for all of his musicals. That's a singular thing. Not very many people can boast that distinction. There's a joke among musical theater people that the history of musical theater can be divided up into two eras, BS and AS, before Sondheim and after Sondheim. And one of the reasons I mention him to you, and I'm going to in some detail, is because his presence on the scene and his musicals made it possible for Jeanine Tesori and Lisa Krone to be able to do a show like Funhome. Funhome is very much in the vein of Sondheim. Okay, so after Gypsy, Sondheim refused to write only lyrics, and he had, in 1960-something, mid-60s, he had a hit on Broadway with a show called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which was a broad comedy, very traditional musical comedy, musical theater, with one distinction. The score was incredibly refreshing because every song was specific to the character singing it. There was no interchangeableness whatsoever. So he wrote the songs and the lyrics as a playwright, as a dramatist, and not as a composer. That's an important distinction. So that is an interesting entree into the musical theater world. But let me tell you a little bit about Stephen Sondheim's background. He was born an only child in New York City, and he was from a broken home with an absent father and a neglectful mother. So as a child, because he was left alone a lot, he befriended the little boy next door, whose father was Oscar Hammerstein. one of the great giants of the musical theater history. So, as you might know, Hammerstein had achieved greatness by writing lyrics with Richard Rodgers for such shows as Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, The Sound of Music, and many more. Sondheim learned a great deal from Hammerstein about how musicals are constructed and written. So having been grounded in the traditions of musical theater and always faithful to them, Sondheim began to elevate the artistic values of musical theater by constantly exploring uncharted territory. So after writing lyrics for Gypsy and West Side Story, and after achieving fame with A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, came a show in 1965 that stunned audiences, and not always in a good way, in a positive way. It was unfamiliar, it was challenging, it was ahead of its time. Now, before I tell you what that Sondheim show was, let me tell you the season before. This is 1965. In 1964, just one season before, Broadway gave the world 3 landmark musicals. And I'm mentioning those musicals to you just so you see in comparison what was being done then and then what Sondheim did. Now, all those 3 musicals are great, but they're still traditional musicals. First one, Fiddler on the Roof, a traditional musical, but it places Jewish characters living in a shtetl, in a village in Russia at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century, center stage. So, Jewish artists had really shaped the musical theater in America for generations, but they were not allowed to tell their stories in the mainstream of the American musical theater. In some ways, Fiddler changed that. Another show, 1964, Funny Girl, Barbra Streisand, age 21, and then only a few years later, by the time she was 25, she did the movie and won the Oscar. It's unheard of. Unheard of for somebody to conquer the world of entertainment and the movie industry with that kind of authority at such a young age. And then the third show, a musical that is a traditional musical comedy, Hello, Dolly. That's 1964. 1965, the Sondheim show comes on the scene, and it's called Anyone Can Whistle. Anyone Can Whistle. The form was so new to musical theater that it confused people. This show is about a corrupt politician, a woman who's the mayor of a bankrupt town, who decides to stay in power by gaslighting the inhabitants of the city. Sound familiar? 1965. There's a scene in the musical where the patients in an insane asylum are accidentally let out of the hospital and they get mixed up with the regular citizens, but no one can tell who is who. Sound familiar? Can you believe that that would be the topic of a musical? Okay, the show starred Angela Lansbury. Now, the reason I mention that to you is because she had no prior experience in musical theater. That was her first musical, which means that already they were looking for somebody who was a bona fide actor and not a typical musical theater performer. Only a few years after that, she will star in Sondheim's Sweeney Todd on Broadway. Okay, Anyone Can Whistle lasted on Broadway only 9 performances, which by any standards is a disaster and a commercial failure, but it became a cult classic. And the producers had enough sense to make a cast recording of the show because they recognized its genius and the fact that it was so forward-looking and so ahead of its time. So, as I said, it set the standard for Sondheim's career. And again, let me reiterate that the reason I'm discussing Sondheim in some detail is because the shift that he brought to the art form of the musical theater made it possible for something like Funhome to come into being. Now, it's not just the storyline or the themes. He would start with the traditions of the American musical theater, and if they needed to shift in order, if content changed the form, then so be it. And he did that with every show. So, I am going to throw at you the titles of a number of Sondheim shows, and very briefly, like in bullet point form, explain to you what they were about. These are traditional musicals. 1970, Company, which has been described as a cubist musical that deals with nuances of married life in an urban setting, in this case, New York City. Why cubist? Because all the experiences of one man's friends who are married are expressed through his vision and his lens. 1971, Follies, a show about a group of middle-aged to old people who were Follies performers. Now, Follies was a form of entertainment that was very popular between the wars. These characters are now old, they have moved on, but when they were young, they were Follies performers. So the show is about the fact that their old theater is about to be turned into a parking lot. So after 30 or 40 years, they decide to have a reunion. And they sing songs that they used to do in their late teens and early 20s, except that they're now in their 60s and 70s. So somebody who used to sing a song called "I'm Just a Broadway Baby," "Walking Off My Tired Feet," which was about a young woman who would do anything to be in a Broadway show, is now standing there and singing that song at age 65. The whole meaning, the whole subtext of the song changes. In 1973 came along a very successful Sondheim show called A Little Night Music. It was based on a film, and nowadays we think that if a musical is based on a film, it's cheap and trashy. But this film was by Ingmar Bergman, and it was called Smiles of a Summer Night. And it gave the world the only song that Sondheim has written that ever made it to the pop music charts, "Send in the Clowns." 1976, things are getting more and more experimental. Now, keep in mind, all of these shows are done on Broadway, which is a commercial venue. 1976, Sondheim's show Pacific Overtures, a show about the opening up of Japan to the Western forces of colonialism. And the original production was in the kabuki style. Think about that. 1979, Sweeney Todd, about a man and a woman. The woman is in love with the man. I'm not sure if the man realizes it, but times are hard, and they kill people and put them in pies and sell the meat pies. Okay. Only days after I saw a chorus line when I was 17, my friends took me back to the theater to see Sweeney Todd with the original cast, with Angela Lansbury. Now, we all know Sweeney Todd. We all know the premise of it. Can you imagine what it felt like to go to the theater and not knowing what you were seeing, and then watch a story about a man and a woman who are killing people and putting their flesh in meat pies and then singing "Have a Little Priest"? It was unheard of. I mean, the shock of it. In 1981, he gave us a musical called "Merrily We Roll Along," which is about a group of young idealistic students, and as they get older, they become more cynical, and the youthful dreams give way to cynicism and practicality and all of that. But here's the thing. In that musical, the last scene comes first and the musical moves backwards. So that by the time you get, the first scene, you see the very cynical older characters, and by the time you're at the end of the show, you see the bubbling, youthful, exuberant people. It's a study in a problematic show, how to direct that and not confuse the audience. 1984, Sunday in the Park with George, which is about Georges Seurat. and the pointillistic artist and the creation of a specific painting, a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. Now, Georges Seurat and the woman with whom he's in love, they never make the connection in Act 1, and it ends very painfully. In Act 2, the spirit of one and the living form of the other one find each other across the century. And they come to an understanding and they connect. It's my favorite Sondheim show. And they sing a song to celebrate that connection, even though time has passed. The song is called Move On. And the woman talks about moving on and not holding on to things that don't matter anymore, and talks about the importance of making choices. And these are the lyrics in that song. She says, "I chose and my world was shaken. So what? The choice may have been mistaken, but choosing was not." That's the brilliance of Sondheim. Then a show that everybody knows, 1987, Into the Woods, which is about fairy tale characters and the notion of them happily living ever after. And in Act 2, we realize that they did not live happily ever after. And all of the stories unfold. And then one last one I want to mention to you, 1990, Assassins, which is a show about people who either assassinated American presidents or attempted to. It is the only show of Sondheim to be done off-Broadway. It eventually went to Broadway, but it was decades later in a totally different production. Now, why would he do that? Why would he write a musical about about assassins of American presidents? There's a song in it. One of the assassins with a gun says, "All you have to do is move your little finger and you can change the world." The premise of the show is that if you want to achieve fame, you don't have to do anything great. If you happen to kill an American president, you will become famous. Isn't that scary? Just like Leonard Bernstein, Stephen Sondheim had thorough education in music composition under several master teachers who were luminaries in American art music and not necessarily musical theater. But unlike Bernstein, who longed to be recognized as a classical composer, Sondheim was completely happy being a musical theater composer. But he managed to elevate the tone of the American musical theater, not just in terms of music, but in terms of drama, character, gravitas, sophistication. So, in part, his achievements include the use of traditional format of the American musical theater to introduce and explore themes, topics, stories, characters that are often outside the traditional frame of the musical theater. Now, every Sondheim musical, just like every Jeanine Tesori musical, has its own particular sound world. The sound world of Sweeney Todd can never be mistaken with the sound world of Into the Woods or Company. Now, on the other side of the coin, there's a composer, Andrew Lloyd Webber. You all know who I'm talking about, Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, Cats. Now, he's a very tuneful composer, but you can take a song from Evita and put it in Cats, and nobody will know the difference. Nobody. That's how unspecific it is to the character. That is exactly what Sondheim didn't do. So, the post-Sondheim era includes a large group of composers, lyricists, which include Jeanine Tesori. Jeanine Tesori was born in 1961, which by any measure is not at all old for a composer of musicals. She was known earlier in her career as Jeanine Levinson. She's not only a composer, she's a musical arranger. And the reason I mention that is because Stephen Sondheim is not a musical arranger. So all of his shows are arranged by other people. That's a distinction that Tesori has that Sondheim does not have. She is the most prolific and honored female theatrical composer in the history of musical theater, with 5 Broadway musicals and 5 Tony Award nominations. She won the 1999 Drama Desk Award for Outstanding Music in a Play for Nicholas Heitner's production of Twelfth Night at Lincoln Center, and the 2004 Drama Desk Award for Outstanding Music for Caroline or Change. And the 2004 Drama Desk Award for Outstanding Music, well, that's Caroline or Change, and then 2015 Tony Award for Best Original Score for Funhome, shared with Lisa Krone, making them the first female writing team to win that award. Her major works include Funhome, Caroline or Change, Shrek, the musical, Thoroughly Modern Millie, and Violet. Shrek the musical and Thoroughly Modern Millie very traditionally fall under the category of more entertainment-type musicals, and Violet, Caroline or Change, and Funhome are in the spirit of Sondheim. They're post-Sondheim shows. She says that her first foray into musical theater was watching a production of Godspell off Broadway when she was 14, and she said about the experience that she felt she was someplace where there's something happening and she doesn't want to be anywhere else. So it really made a huge impression. She is a graduate of Barnard College. Initially, her major was pre-med, but she changed it to music. The show Violet was performed on Broadway at Playwrights Horizons in 1997. Does anybody know that show, Violet? It went to Broadway, but not till 2014. So it was an off-Broadway musical. Violet is about a young woman in the rural South. She lives on a farm with her father, and when she was young, as she was working on the farm with her father, a freak accident happened, and some farming instrument flew out of her father's hand and hit her face, and she was disfigured. So she has this mark on her face. But the way that it's done in the musical, there's no makeup used. So you never know whether she's imagining it or if it's real. That's a brilliant choice. And so she holds herself back from experiencing life fully, and she travels a long distance to visit with an evangelist who's going to pray this away. And then by the end of the musical, she realizes that if she loves and accepts herself, then she can love somebody else, and this no longer exists, and maybe it didn't exist to begin with. At the start of the 20th century, there were a group of artists, poets, playwrights, musicians, who were so sick and tired of what they considered to be the commercial tone and the consumer's tone of Broadway, that they decided to start a movement which eventually became off-Broadway. Now, an off-Broadway theater versus a Broadway theater in New York City has other designations as well. It's a simple question of city zoning. If a theater is between this block and this block, it's Broadway. If it's outside of that, it's off-Broadway. The size of the theater determines that too. But in terms of this, the artistic spirit of it, it was a movement, the off-Broadway movement, to be less commercial and more artistic, dealing with topics that are politically and socially challenging, and not having to worry about money. So when we talk about Violet being, or Assassins being an off-Broadway show, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a kind of show that probably was created in that spirit. as opposed to a formula work that is designed to make money. Now, when a show of that nature is transferred to Broadway, it's for very specific reasons. And as I said, Assassins was one such show, and so was Sunday in the Park with George. But Sunday in the Park with George moved on to Broadway pretty quickly. And partly because there was a critic, Frank Rich, who was the main drama critic of the New York Times. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but the New York Times review for plays, for musicals, is essential to the success of the musical. If the New York Times gives the show a good review, it will go on and it will sell tickets. And if it gets a bad review, chances are it'll be closed down. Now, Sunday in the Park with George was not the kind of show that would be necessarily commercial. But Frank Rich loved it so much that he wrote a glowing review, and then for weeks afterwards, he kept reviewing it. He reviewed it about 3 or 4 times, and eventually it found an audience. That's interesting. That means that if New York Times vouches for it, and there's an audience that's excited about seeing it, then an off-Broadway musical will move to Broadway. And that was exactly what happened with Funhome. So let me read to you what I have here, and then I will leave my notes behind and speak to you from my heart, because I saw Funhome when it was done off-Broadway, and it was not just the material, not just the tone of it, not just the musical composition, but the design, the direction. It was an alignment of all of those things. In adapting Alison Bechdel's graphic novel into the musical Funhome, the creative team invited Lisa Krone to take the assignment. Lisa Krone. Lisa Krone is a significant actor and playwright who is Jewish, lesbian, and from Ann Arbor. I mean, what more do you need? Her father was born in Germany, and he was a Holocaust survivor. One of her plays, entitled 2.5-Minute Ride, is an account of a trip she took with her father to Auschwitz, which is where his parents were exterminated. In her adaptation of the graphic novel, Lisa Krone used a rather familiar theatrical technique. Do you know what this is? Because I know you all have read the graphic novel. The character of Alison in the play is given to 3 actors at various stages of the character's life. A child, when she goes to college, and then the adult Alison. Now, that's a very familiar theatrical device, but the way that's used in this show, the way that's utilized by Lisa Krone is very organic, because sometimes the older Alison is literally watching over the shoulder of the younger ones. And it's very strategically chosen as to what age. And sometimes you see all 3 of them, and as an audience person, you put together the experience coming from 3 different times in one person's life. And it brings up something interesting that sometimes we forget, that as I get close to the age of 60, which is going to be this year, that I can still be the 15-year-old boy, that person still in me exists somewhere. And the musical clarifies that in an amazing way. Funhome might be described as a universal detective story. So, as I said, it's set in 3 ages of one woman's life. It tries to solve the sort of classic mystery that keeps grown-ups in therapy, in analysis for decades: our parents. Who are these strange people who gave us life? And what is our connection with them? And what role do they play in our lives? It's timeless, it's universal, but it is told from the perspective of a graphic artist who's a lesbian. The New York Times review said, "The focus keeps changing in Funhome, directed with vivid precision and haunting emotional ambiguity by Sam Gold, who won a Tony for his direction, as do the time-stopping frames of the woman whose memory we inhabit." That's Alison, a 43-year-old graphic artist who is using her pen to draw her past into perspective, or trying to. The objects she sees in the rearview mirror are both closer and farther away than they appear. So, as I said to you before, the adult Alison is seen on stage peering over the shoulders of her younger selves, wincing at what she was. She also conjures up the carefully restored museum-like old house where she lived with her brothers, the Oberlin College campus where she fell in love with a woman named Joan, and the lonely drawing desk where Alison works to give shape and substance to her ghosts. Now, it brings me to the character of Alison, a leading character in a musical, being a lesbian. And I want to talk to you about that because it's something that it needs to be looked at. And so I'm going to bring it up to you, hopefully to bring up questions, research questions possibly. Let me take you back to the mid-1970s when I told you I saw my first musical on Broadway, A Chorus Line. And you know, the entire show is in real time, about a group of Broadway dancers auditioning to get into a show. But by the end of the night, many people whom you as the audience have come to know and possibly like among the characters on stage are cut. They don't get the job. The story is so specific to show business and Broadway but the reality of living daily life with that kind of rejection had such a universal resonance with many audiences whose personal lives were as far away from show business and Broadway and musicals as possible. That's why it made such an impression. So, and that's why for a while it was the longest running show on Broadway. The thing that A Chorus Line has also, in my mind, in common with Funhome is the fact that it's based on real stories. Michael Bennett, who was the director choreographer of the show, gathered a group of dancers, Broadway dancers, together in his apartment over several sessions and asked them to tell stories about their experiences. And he recorded them. And then he boiled them down into this musical. He stole their stories. He gave them something like $5 a piece for them to waive their rights to their stories. And if he hired them to be in the show, some people realized that their story went to somebody else to do on stage. Imagine that. So when the show became a huge hit, none of those people who had shared their stories had any rights to the profits. That's showbiz. Okay. There's a moment in the show where a dancer tries to do a turn, but he falls down and twists his ankle pretty badly, and he has to be taken to the emergency room. So the human reaction of his competitors around him to this unfortunate event was significant of the profound humanity of that show. So when the dancer who fell down is taken to the hospital and the rest of the group tries to pull themselves together, the director turns to the group of auditionees and asks a question. Now, this is an example of a scene of dialogue moving into a song. And I remember vividly in the mid-70s when I saw the show, this moment that I'm telling you about. And I'm getting goosebumps just telling you. So the director says, if you couldn't do this, if you got up tomorrow and you couldn't dance anymore, what would you do? And the music starts and a character sings, kiss today goodbye. The sweetness and the sorrow, wish me luck, the same to you. But I can't forget what I did for love. Now in the movie, they changed that into a love song between a man and a woman, but that's not what it is. It is the idea that, especially in America, the way that artists are treated, you do it for love and not for money. And the song goes on to say, look, my eyes are dry. The gift was ours to borrow, which makes it an anthem for all of us who are in show business, because you realize that the gift that you think is yours is not yours. It's just yours to borrow. And someday it'll be taken away. And we live with that ongoing anxiety that the next time that I go to direct, will I be able to summon on that gift and have anything to say? It's an exhilarating way of living, and it's a painful way of living. We did what we had to do, the song goes on to say, but I can't regret what I did for love. The character who unfortunately falls down and sprains his ankle, his name is Paul. And in a stunning earlier scene in the show, which is not set to music, he faces the audience and tells the story of how his parents found out he was gay. He was accidentally outed. It was really the first time that any of us who went to the theater were actually seeing a character on stage admitting that they were gay. I mean, nowadays, with shows like Will and Grace and everything that you've seen, none of that existed. And to have that reflected back at us was unbelievable. Now, it was astonishing, it was moving, it was inspiring, it was sad because the story is so sad and so filled with shame. There were no pride parades yet. Stephen Sondheim is gay. Leonard Bernstein is gay, or at least bisexual. So many people who are movers and shakers in musical theater were and are gay, but they could not tell their stories on stage. They could not even mention them in passing. Michael Bennett, who created A Chorus Line, was gay, but he was married to the leading lady of A Chorus Line, Donna McKechnie, as a cover to appear straight. After their marriage fell apart, he was told not to take a male date to the Tony Awards because he probably wouldn't want to give the impression that he's gay. In the theater. It's astonishing. This is not that long ago. But there's another thing. As the years went by, more and more gay characters appeared on stage, and then in 1994, Tony Kushner's Angels in America became the play about the intersection of politics and identity, homosexuality, gay rights, AIDS. Right-wing versus left-wing politics, and a stinging critique of the Reagan administration's refusal to acknowledge that there was a pandemic known as AIDS. They refused to even mention it. So that's what that play is about. There's a character in Angels in America, as you may know, Prior Walter, who is dying of AIDS, but he asks for more life. And instead of dying at the end of the play and giving the audience his easy catharsis, he lives. He lives against all odds. That's very unique. Every time that we look at a play or a musical in which there's a death, if we really concentrate on why somebody was killed off, it tells us a lot about where we are as a society. By the time Angels in America had hit Broadway in 1994, Michael Bennett, the creator of A Chorus Line, had already died of AIDS, 1987. Dramatic works with male homosexual characters became more and more frequent in the mainstream of the American theater. But where were the women? Where were the lesbians? They could write and perform their plays in grungy, rat-infested East Village performance spaces, but Broadway was not interested. During the years that gay men were dying of AIDS by the thousands, our lesbian sisters took care of their sick gay brothers who were dying of AIDS. They did that. They took it upon themselves to do that. But once there were medical advances and being HIV positive was no longer a death sentence, the same men forgot to open the doors of the theater to their lesbian sisters. This is a fact. It's very rare to find a lesbian character in a musical. In the mid-90s, there was a musical called Falsettos, in which there's a Jewish character by the name of Marvin, married to Trina. They have a little boy named Jason, and Marvin leaves his wife and son because he's fallen in love with a man, Whizzer. Now, the family breaks apart, but the family comes back together in a totally new configuration because the little boy, Jason, can relate to his father's boyfriend more than anybody. So by virtue of that connection, the configuration of the family changes. But then by the end of the show, Whizzer is dying of AIDS. In fact, he dies. The audience cries. They get their catharsis. In that musical, there are two lesbian characters who are in a relationship. They have names, they have jobs. One of them is a doctor who actually is doing research on AIDS. But among musical theater people, those characters are referred to as the lesbians next door. That's it. And their function in the show is to take care of the gay men, especially when one of them gets sick. So that is very close to what I told you about lesbians at the height of AIDS taking care of and tending to gay men who were sick. And I'm going to leave you with this, bring it back to Jeanine Tesori and Lisa Krone's adaptation of Funhome. Here, in this adaptation and in this book, we get this family drama where the father is gay and closeted, and he has a daughter who's gay. She's not there as a supporting character. She's not the lesbian next door taking care of the gay man. In fact, if anything, it is the father who functions as in a supporting role. The denials, the secrecy, the subtextual existence, and the choices of the father that may not have been good ones lead to the daughter to find a life that is not secretive and closeted. And she uses the power of her art to liberate her life and allow others in similar situation to possibly find liberation. I would call that progress. Slow, but definitely progress. So the next step, I believe, and this is going to happen because the beginnings of it are in evidence already. The next step for the American theater and for musical theater is to break another barrier, to be totally and meaningfully inclusive of trans lives and trans experiences. We still have an award system, whether it's Tonys or the Oscars, that give awards to male actors, actresses. There's that binary thing. And there are trans people that are fighting valiantly for their survival, but in the process to teach us the fluidity of gender. And I believe, and it has already happened in the American theater, and it's going to happen more and more, I believe. So I believe it is time for the American theater to tell that story and those stories. Thank you so much. Wow. I just looked at my watch. I didn't realize I talked so much. I'm so sorry. I thought it was going to be less than that. Do you have any questions? Is that how you do it? Or, yeah. Do you have any questions for me?
So I remember reading Joshua Logan's autobiography, and he talked about Broadway being this place that is manipulated is one word, but it appeals to blue-haired women from the suburbs. Those are the people who go to Broadway. And I guess my question is, what is it about Broadway that has been so successful in bringing along blue-haired women from the suburbs, even to the point it is now? I mean, we know they don't vote this way. So why has Broadway been so successful in bringing them along?
In catering to that specific audience?
I mean, they're going to see Funhome. Because who else is going? I mean, they're going to see Funhome. They're going to see these plays. So how did that happen, do you think?
You know, the makeup of the audience changes. I mean, if that is the target, or if that has traditionally been the target audience, when you go and see Funhome or Hedwig and the Angry Inch, you get an audience that is diverse, and in many ways it's a very hopeful sign, very open to that, instead of it being just targeted to a specific element of the audience. I was when I saw Hedwig and the Angry Inch, I was very astonished by, you can tell who's sitting next to you, and they were completely following that character's story. Completely. So I think over the years that has changed. Who goes to musicals? That's what I think, Marty.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Anything else? Go ahead.
Have you seen the musical Rent before I ask this question?
Yes.
How do you feel about the interpretation of the English character where they have to specify rather than transgender or
I have major problems with the show Rent. I never became a fan. And what you brought up about the character Angel is very valid, very valid. But remember, this is late 90s. But there's another thing about it too. The character Angel dies of AIDS. But the straight characters on stage who have AIDS not only don't die, they somehow magically survive it. Do you remember that? Do you know what I'm talking about? That's a statement. How come he dies, or she dies, or they died, but do you know what I mean? That's what I meant when I say look closely as to who is killed off and who stays alive at the end of the show. It makes statements about whose stories we value, who we want to see, and who we're okay not seeing. I mean, when Tennessee Williams was writing his early plays, there were gay characters in his plays, he being a gay himself. And this is way before, this is in the 40s, 1940s. There were gay characters who were already dead by the time the play started. So people just talked about them. You know what I mean? Even in Shakespeare, if you look at the ending of a play like King Lear and who is left alive at the end of King Lear, it's those characters who are not corrupt. And hopefully they will make the society move forward in a positive way. So I have a lot of issues with Rent. Yeah. Go ahead.
When you were finally able to understand the lyrics in the story of Oklahoma, how did it change your experience?
Can I tell you something? Here's what happened. So I didn't listen to it again. I sort of forgot about it. And then in the early 80s, I got a job in summer stock on Cape Cod. And that was one of the shows, and I acted in it. And then I understood the story. And I understood what was going on. In my imagination as a child, I had pictured it differently. I'm not saying that it was a disappointment or anything like that, but one thing that didn't change was that amazing exuberance and energy that I experienced when I was listening to it. It was all there. I mean, at the end of the show, when they sing Oklahoma, that number, they're singing about Oklahoma. I haven't even been there. Yeah, chances are, but we sing, we know we belong to the land. And you just feel uplifted by it. I certainly wouldn't like to, in terms of my politics, I wouldn't want to move to Oklahoma. That's very interesting. I never thought about that. I'll think about it more. Anything else? Thank you so much for coming.